They're trained to hunt us. They'll kill anyone that gets in their way. Like your girlfriend. We have to get her out of here!
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to Puffin Movie Review, the only spot on the internet where we get our minds right, light up something potent, and pull back the curtain on what actually went down behind the scenes of our favorite flicks. If you are chilling with us today, do me a massive favor. Hit that subscribe button and tap that like button. We are pushing incredibly hard right now to hit our 1,000 subscriber milestone, and having you join the circle makes a huge difference.
Happened. Could set me free, but why settle on one place when you could have the whole world?
Today we are packing a fresh bowl and staring blankly into the beautiful, chaotic void of the 2008 sci-fi action flick, Jumper. Man, when you're elevated, the idea of just blinking and instantly being on top of a sphinx in Egypt or chilling on a beach is the ultimate dream. But the actual process of getting this movie made? It was a complete, high-stress logistical nightmare. Let's spark this up and look at how the first phase of this movie completely shifted gears before a single camera even rolled. So this whole trip starts back in November of 2005. New Regency Productions decides they want to adapt this really cool science fiction novel by Stephen Gould called Jumper. They hire director Doug Liman to helm the ship, the guy who did The Bourne Identity, so you know he knows how to handle pacing. But the script? Man, the script went through a total blender. Originally, David S. Goyer wrote the adapted screenplay. Then the studio hired Jim Wools to rewrite Goyer's work. But Doug Liman got into the room, read it, and decided he wanted another rewrite, bringing in Simon Kinberg to finally finish the damn thing. Liman later said it was 100% Stephen Gould's story, just completely reinvented for the screen. Luckily, Gould actually read the changes and gave them his blessing, which is rare for an author. The studio was so incredibly confident in this concept that before they even started filming, they were already publicly bragging about making a whole trilogy out of it.
72, Utah, take 6, the only marker. Leave me alone.
This might hurt a little bit.
Normally, a movie has one storyboard artist who sits down and draws out the scenes. But because teleportation is a total mind-bender to visualize, Jumper required 6 different storyboard artists, with each one assigned to a single specific action sequence. The production team had to lay down strict fundamental laws about how jumping actually worked so the artists didn't break the logic of the universe. One of the artists, a guy named Rob McCallum, mentioned that he spent hours just sitting there baked out of his mind. Well, he didn't say that part, but I am thinking, how would a guy who can teleport actually fight? It forced them to come up with some incredibly inventive, spectacular visual tricks to make the talent look cool on screen. Now, this is where the production hits a massive speed bump, and honestly, it's hilarious. In April of 2006, they officially cast the movie. They hired Tom Sturridge to play the lead role of David, with Teresa Palmer and Jamie Bell backing him up. A few months later, they scored Samuel L. Jackson to play the villain, Roland Cox. They had everything lined up to shoot in Tokyo, Rome, Toronto, and New York. Then, in June of 2006, a top studio executive named Tom Rothman walks into the room, looks at Doug Liman, and completely pulls the emergency brake. The executive panic. Rothman looks at the casting and says, "The lead actor is 18. Wouldn't a movie be better if he were 25? You have a huge movie here, and adults won't go see an 18-year-old. They'll just think it's a kid's movie." Liman actually agreed because he wanted to lean harder into the romance, so they halted the entire production. Just 2 weeks before principal photography was supposed to start, they completely fired the lead actor, Tom Sturridge, because the studio panicked about not having a big enough star. Get this, the studio executives actually begged Liman to cast Eminem as the lead. Can you imagine Slim Shady teleporting around the world? Liman stood his ground and said absolutely not, choosing to cast Hayden Christensen instead, who was fresh off the Star Wars prequels. And because they replaced the lead guy with a 25-year-old Hayden, the director decided Teresa Palmer looked way too young next to him, so they fired her too and replaced her with Rachel Bilson. Man, imagine getting fired 2 weeks before work starts just because a suit decided you look too young. Hollywood is completely cutthroat.
Diverging fairly heavily from my book, but I don't have a problem with that at all for several reasons.
Alright, so the casting musical chairs is finally over. They have their team, and now they actually have to go out and shoot this globe-trotting madness. And look, when you are completely elevated, the logistics of this shoot will straight up make your brain short-circuit. They literally filmed in 20 different cities across 14 countries. Just thinking about the jet lag alone is giving me a contact headache. Let's break down the absolute chaos of this middle stretch of production. In September of 2006, they start hitting locations in Ontario, Canada, before moving principal photography to Toronto. But by December, director Doug Liman pulls off a minor miracle. He negotiates with the Rome Film Commission to get rare, 3-day access to film inside the actual Colosseum. Originally, the scene was written for the Pantheon, but they shifted it, only keeping the Pantheon for some exterior shots. Now, filming in an ancient world wonder isn't like renting out a local studio. The Italian authorities gave them some incredibly strict, high-stress rules. No equipment on the ground. The crew couldn't rest a single heavy light or camera stand on the ancient stone. Everything had to be suspended in the air, using complex harnesses. Natural light only. They weren't allowed to bring in massive movie lights, meaning they were entirely at the mercy of the sun. The 45-minute window to keep from disturbing the waves of tourists, they were only allowed to shoot for 45 minutes in the morning and 45 minutes in the evening. To maximize those tiny 45-minute windows, they set up 4 Steadicams simultaneously just so they wouldn't waste a single second reloading film. Because they could only capture so much real footage, the visual effects team had to get incredibly creative. They had to mix real Colosseum footage, build physical sets that required digital extensions, and in some cases, build the entire amphitheater completely from scratch using computers. After Rome, they head back to the freezing winter of Toronto to wrap up the Canadian leg of the shoot in January of 2007. But on January 26th, a dark cloud completely hits the production. While dismantling an outdoor set in brutal icy conditions, a 56-year-old set dresser named David Ritchie was fatally struck by frozen debris. Another worker was severely injured in the accident and rushed to the hospital with major head and shoulder trauma. It's a harsh, heavy reminder that behind all the movie magic, these crews are putting in serious, sometimes incredibly dangerous physical labor to build these worlds. Next, the circus packs up and flies to Tokyo. They wanted to capture the frantic energy of the city, but it led to some pure logistical insanity. For one specific sequence, they had to do over 30 takes because they were only allowed to film in the brief, chaotic gaps between traffic light changes. Just picture a full Hollywood crew sprinting into the street the second the light turns red, trying to get the shot, and scattering before the cars start moving again. To make things even more stressful, Doug Liman insisted that Hayden Christensen perform his own stunts. Man, Hayden took an absolute beating for this movie. By the time they finished shooting various action scenes, he had severely injured his hand, split his ear wide open, and developed a hyper-dilated pupil that required an actual emergency hospital visit. Imagine looking in the mirror, and one of your pupils is just completely blown out. Trippy, but terrifying. By February, they landed in Ann Arbor, Michigan to shoot at Gallup Park. To fill out the scenes, they cast 60 students from the nearby Huron High School as in extras, and even brought 20 of them back months later in September for some additional reshoots. Now let's talk about the actual jumps. Originally, the legendary New Zealand studio Weta Digital was just hired to make a quick preview clip for the 2007 Comic-Con. But they did such an incredible job that their team of 100 employees ended up handling 300 of the 600 visual effects shots in the final movie. There are over 100 teleportation jumps in the film, and the crew didn't want them to look generic. Every single jump was modified based on how far the character was traveling and where they were landing. To build these, they used specialized software like Nuke and Shake, and used Maya to construct massive digital replicas of landmarks like Big Ben and the Sphinx. The visual effects supervisor, Eric Winquist, explained that the look of the jumps completely evolved during post-production. They used still array camera footage, but they intentionally avoided copying the Matrix. The anti-Matrix effect, the Matrix, was all about bullet time completely stopping time while the camera moves. Jumper did the exact opposite. They used slow shutter speeds on those multi-camera rigs to create a heavily streaked, motion-blurred image as the perspective shifted. It gave the teleportation a violent, physics-bending aesthetic rather than a frozen moment. Other heavy-hitting VFX studios like Hydraulx, Digital Domain, Pixel Magic, and Lightwave 3D were also brought in to help piece this massive puzzle together. Man, 4 Steadicams running at the same time in the Colosseum, actors getting their ears split open, and redefining the laws of visual effects. This movie was a literal chaotic circus traveling around the globe.
Living like this with no consequences? There are always consequences.
So, the movie finally drops, the dust settles from all that crazy location shooting, and the critics completely pull out their knives. The review scores are honestly kind of hilarious when you look back at them. Rotten Tomatoes. A pretty brutal 15% approval rating from 169 critics. The official consensus basically said the characters were completely uninvolving, the narrative was loose, and the special effects were lackluster. Metacritic squeaked out a 35 out of 100, which is firmly in the generally unfavorable zone. CinemaScore, but once again, regular people just looking for a fun time gave it a solid B. Now, some critics were actually a bit gentle. Mark Silo from the Austin Chronicle called it pretty slick, entertaining stuff, saying it was a tight, action-packed bundle of nerviness. Empire magazine gave a pretty balanced verdict too, calling it Doug Liman's least charismatic and least developed action movie, but admitting it still packed some cracking action into a brief running time and laid down the foundations for a great franchise. But then you have the heavy hitters who completely lost their minds. An Australian film reviewer named David Stratton went absolutely savage on this thing. The half-star Rose Stratton stated that Jumper represented a brand new watershed moment in the history of cinema, because it literally had no plot, no characters, and no action scenes that made any kind of sense. He handed the movie a miserable half a star out of 5. Despite the critical thrashing, the movie did get some industry nods. It was nominated for Best Science Fiction Film and Best Music at the Saturn Awards, but man, talk about bad timing. It ended up losing those awards to Iron Man and The Dark Knight. I mean, if you're going to lose, you might as well lose to the absolute titans of 2008 cinema. Even though the critics were crying foul, the studio's marketing machine knew exactly what they were doing. They released the film on February 14, 2008, specifically targeting couples and anyone under the age of 25 looking for a fast-paced date night movie on Valentine's Day. And the gamble paid off big time. Jumper grossed $27.3 million over its opening weekend, playing on 4,600 screens across 3,428 theaters, easily snatching the #1 spot at the box office. It even set the record for the largest February release in South Korea and dominated the top spot in 11 different international markets right out of the gate. Box office territory. Gross revenue United States and Canada, $80.1 million international territories, $142.0 million total worldwide gross, $221.2 million. They built this thing on an $85 million budget, and it went on to become the 28th highest grossing film worldwide for the entire year of 2008. So while the critics were complaining about a lack of plot, the studio executives were laughing all the way to the bank.
My name's Griffin, and if there's one thing I hate, it's people not minding their own business.
But we cannot talk about the marketing without talking about the video game tie-in, because this is where things get truly hilarious. They released a game called Jumper Griffin's Story for the Xbox 360, PlayStation 2, and the Wii. It came out on February 12th, 2 days before the movie hit theaters. The story focused on Jamie Bell's character, Griffin, trying to avenge his parents. A top executive from the game publisher, Brash Entertainment, actually said that from the very first script read, they knew it had to be a game because teleportation makes for compelling gameplay. Well, the execution was an absolute disaster. The reviews came back and they were completely underground. PlayStation 2 35% positive rating. Xbox 360 28% positive rating. Nintendo Wii, a miserable 23% positive rating. The legendary Damon Hatfield over at IGN reviewed the Xbox 360 version and completely destroyed it in one sentence. He called out the incredibly low production values, the totally monotonous gameplay, and the lackluster visuals, concluding that it was simply a story you can jump past. It was the epitome of a rushed, half-baked movie tie, and that left players completely tapping out after an hour. Man, a movie that prints over $220 million while the critic gives it half a star, backed by a video game that you can beat in 2 hours and looks like a PlayStation 1 title. You gotta love the chaotic energy of the late 2000s studio system.
You only did one. It's not like you're
I've been trying. Trust me, I've been trying.
Well, you don't have enough to do another power attack.
Man, if you think the actual production of this movie was a complete trip, looking into what they plan to do next is going to completely melt your mind. When you are sitting here in an elevated state, looking back at the massive grand designs Hollywood had for this universe, it just shows how quickly the studio machine can spin an absolute fantasy. Let's look at the grand finale of this Jumper deep dive, the sequels we were promised, the insane concepts they cooked up, and the bizarre place this franchise eventually landed. Before the movie even hit theaters, the studio and the creative team weren't just thinking about a sequel, they were fully mapping out an entire cinematic universe. Author Stephen Gould had already dropped a second book called Reflex in 2004, and eventually put out 2 more novels down the line. During production, producer Lucas Foster openly admitted that their ideas for the world were so massive, they couldn't possibly fit into 1 or 2 movies. They explicitly planned a 3-movie story arc from the very beginning. But get this, instead of just making a solid first film, they literally sliced up the narrative of the first script to intentionally leave gaping holes and room for parts 2 and 3. Hayden Christensen was completely on board for it too, talking in interviews about how carefully Doug Liman had set up these characters so they would have plenty of room to grow over a multi-film journey. They were completely convinced they had the next Matrix or Star Wars on their hands. Now, even though the critical backlash completely derailed those trilogy plans, Doug Liman didn't stop dreaming. He had some absolutely wild ideas for where Jumper 2 would have gone. If you think blinking onto a bank vault is crazy, listen to what Liman wanted to do next. Interplanetary jumping, he wanted the characters to figure out how to teleport to other planets. Just imagine Hayden Christensen instantly chilling on Mars because he felt like it. Time travel. He wanted them to be able to jump through time cracks, completely turning the franchise into a sci-fi historical epic. Espionage warfare, the Jumpers would use their powers to become the ultimate global spies. He also wanted to adapt a massive plot point from the book's sequel, Reflex, where Rachel Bilson's character learns how to jump too. They actually hinted at this in the first movie, when David knocked her unconscious right before jumping her out of a river and straight into a library. The 2026 reality check, but man, look at where we are. It is officially 2026, almost 2 decades since that movie dropped on Valentine's Day, and those grand sequel ideas are completely dead in the water. We haven't gotten a single real update on a theatrical sequel in years. The Hollywood dream completely evaporated. Instead of a massive blockbuster sequel on the big screen, the franchise ended up taking a very strange digital detour. On June 6, 2018, they released a spin-off television series called Impulse on YouTube Premium. Doug Liman actually came back to executive produce it and direct the pilot. The show was loosely based on Stephen Gould's 3rd novel, focusing on a completely different story. It was a critical success, and actually got a lot of praise for being a dark, gritty character study, but because it was locked behind a YouTube Premium paywall back when the platform was trying to do original scripted shows, a ton of mainstream movie fans didn't even realize it existed. Man, jumping to other planets and traveling through time, that sounds like the kind of pitch you write down on a napkin at 3 a.m. after a heavy session with the green. It's a bummer we never got to see Hayden Christensen teleporting to Jupiter. Man, it is truly wild to think about what Jumper could have been. We were almost living in a world where Hayden Christensen was teleporting to Mars and jumping through time cracks. But instead, here we are, in 2026, with a forgotten YouTube Premium spin-off and a broken Xbox 360 game that gets roasted to this day. You really have to love the pure, unhinged ambition of late 2000s Hollywood. But I want to hear from the circle. What do you think? Would you have watched a sequel if Doug Liman actually got to take these characters to other planets and introduce time travel? Or do you think the half-star critics were right to leave this one in the past? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you had a good time rolling up, relaxing, and diving into some chaotic movie history with me today, please do me a massive favor and hit that like button. And if you haven't yet, join the crew and hit subscribe. We are pushing incredibly hard to reach that 1,000 subscriber milestone, and every single one of you clicking that button helps the channel grow more than you know. Thank you so much for hanging out, packing a bowl, and talking cinema with me. Stay safe, keep it completely chill, and I will catch you right here for the next review.